You've got to be kidding me. The words cut through the humid morning air at Camp Pendleton like a blade, sharp with the kind of frustration that comes when everything you thought you knew gets turned upside down. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stood behind the firing line, his binoculars trained on the distant targets, watching yet another round miss its mark by what might as well have been miles. The sound of the rifle report echoed across the range, followed by the metallic ping of the bolt cycling, then silence. Dead, empty silence. For the third consecutive day, the Marine Corps' most elite sniper candidates were failing spectacularly. These weren't fresh recruits stumbling through basic training. These were hand-picked warriors, men who had already proven themselves in combat zones across 3 continents. Each had been selected from thousands of applicants to attend the most prestigious marksmanship school in the world. They were supposed to be the best of the best, the tip of the spear, the invisible guardians who could reach out and touch a target from distances that defied comprehension. Instead, they were missing everything. Rodriguez lowered his binoculars and shook his head. The target, a standard silhouette positioned at 800 yards, remained untouched. Clean. Pristine, mocking them with its perfect condition. Behind him, 12 Marines lay prone on their shooting mats, their faces pressed against the stocks of their rifles, sweat beading on their foreheads despite the cool morning breeze rolling in from the Pacific. This wasn't supposed to happen. The Marine Corps Scout Sniper School had a reputation that stretched back generations. It was where legends were forged, where ordinary Marines transformed into mythical figures capable of impossible shots. The instructors here had trained some of the most lethal marksmen in military history, men whose names were spoken in whispered reverence in barracks around the world. But something was wrong. Terribly, inexplicably wrong. Corporal Jenkins, a lean kid from Montana who could put 5 rounds through the same hole at 300 yards with his hunting rifle back home, had just sent his 10th consecutive shot into the dirt berm, 20 feet short of the target. His breathing was controlled, his form textbook perfect, his equipment zeroed to mechanical precision. By every measure that mattered, he should have been putting rounds center mass with boring consistency. The same story repeated itself down the line. Sergeant Martinez from Texas, who had made confirmed kills at over 1,000 yards in Afghanistan, couldn't hit a target the size of a refrigerator at 800. Lance Corporal Thompson, whose steady hands and eagle eyes had earned him commendations in 2 combat deployments, was spraying rounds like he was firing from the hip. It made no sense. None of it made any sense. Rodriguez had been an instructor at the school for 6 years. He'd seen nervous Marines shake off their jitters and find their rhythm. He'd watched overconfident hotshots get humbled and then rebuilt into true professionals. He'd guided hundreds of students through the grueling curriculum that separated the merely good from the genuinely exceptional. But he'd never seen anything like this. An entire class, collectively and simultaneously, forgetting how to shoot. The morning briefing had been standard. Weather conditions were ideal. Light wind from the west at 5 miles per hour, temperature holding steady at 68 degrees, humidity low. The kind of conditions that made long-range shooting almost easy. The rifles were M40A5s, the same platform these Marines had trained on for months. The ammunition was match grade, lot tested for consistency. Every variable had been controlled, every detail accounted for, yet the results spoke for themselves. Or rather, they didn't speak at all. They screamed. Behind the firing line, in a small observation tower, Colonel Harrison watched through his own set of binoculars. He was a man whose presence commanded respect without saying a word, whose chest bore the ribbons that told the story of 3 decades of service in the world's most unforgiving places. He'd built his reputation on precision, on attention to detail, on the kind of relentless pursuit of perfection that turned good Marines into great ones. This was not great. This was not even good. This was a disaster that threatened to undermine everything the school represented. The colonel's jaw tightened as he watched another shot sail wide. These weren't random misses. There was a pattern here, a consistency to the failure that suggested something deeper than simple nerves or equipment malfunction. The shots were clustering, but they were clustering in the wrong place. Every Marine was experiencing the same phenomenon. Every shot was falling short, and to the right, as if some invisible force was dragging their bullets away from their intended targets. He'd seen this before, not here, not at his school, but somewhere else, somewhere in the distant past, when he was young and eager and thought he knew everything there was to know about putting lead on target. It was a memory that nagged at him, a half-remembered lesson from a time when the world was different, and the enemies wore different uniforms. Down on the firing line, Rodriguez was running out of ideas. He'd checked and rechecked the rifles. He'd verified the zeros, examined the ammunition, even had the Marines switch positions to rule out some bizarre environmental factor affecting specific lanes. Nothing changed. The pattern held. Miss after miss after miss, each one falling in the same relative position. The frustration was palpable now. These Marines had been selected for this course based on their demonstrated ability to shoot. It was their identity, their calling card, the thing that separated them from the ordinary infantry. To suddenly find themselves unable to perform the most basic function of their craft was more than embarrassing. It was devastating. Sergeant Martinez pushed himself up from his shooting mat, his face flushed with anger and confusion. He'd been shooting competitively since he was 12 years old. He'd grown up on a ranch where hitting what you aimed at wasn't a skill. It was survival. Missing wasn't just failure. It was incomprehensible. The morning stretched on, each failed shot adding weight to the growing sense that something fundamental had shifted. The confidence these Marines had built over years of training and combat experience was evaporating like morning mist. Doubt crept in, the kind of doubt that could destroy a sniper's effectiveness permanently. When you stopped believing in your ability to make the shot, you'd already lost. Rodriguez called for a ceasefire and gathered his students around him. 12 faces stared back at him, each one a mixture of confusion, frustration, and barely contained panic. These were men accustomed to excellence, trained to overcome any obstacle through discipline and determination. But you couldn't fight an enemy you couldn't identify, couldn't solve a problem you couldn't understand. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the range. In the distance, the Pacific Ocean sparkled like scattered diamonds, indifferent to the crisis unfolding on the shooting line. Somewhere in those hills, an old man was walking his dog, unaware that his quiet morning routine was about to intersect with 12 of America's finest warriors in a way that would change everything. The secret they needed wasn't written in any manual. It wasn't taught in any classroom or demonstrated in any PowerPoint presentation. It was carried in the weathered hands and sharp eyes of a man who had learned it the hard way, in places where missing meant more than embarrassment. It meant death. But first, they had to meet him. The old man's name was Frank Castellano, though most people who knew him just called him Frank. He was 78 years old, with silver hair that caught the morning light and hands that bore the calluses of a lifetime spent working with tools, weapons, and the unforgiving machinery of war. He walked with the measured pace of someone who had learned that rushing rarely solved anything, his weathered face carrying the kind of calm that only came from having seen the worst the world had to offer, and somehow finding peace on the other side. He wasn't supposed to be at Camp Pendleton that morning. His routine rarely varied from the small coastal trail that wound through the hills above his modest house, where he'd lived quietly for the past 15 years. But his dog, a stubborn German shepherd named Gunner, had decided to chase a rabbit down an unfamiliar path, leading them both toward the distant sound of rifle fire. Frank paused at the chain-link fence that marked the boundary of the range complex. watching the small figures in the distance through eyes that had once been trained to spot enemy movement at distances that would make most people dizzy. Even from half a mile away, he could see the frustration in their body language, the way they clustered together in the universal posture of men trying to solve an impossible problem. He'd been there before. Different war, different weapons, different enemies, but the same crushing weight of failure when everything you thought you knew suddenly stopped working. The same desperate search for answers that seemed to dance just beyond reach. Gunnar had given up on the rabbit and was now sniffing at something in the scrub brush, his tail wagging with the simple joy of a creature unburdened by the complexities that plagued human endeavours. Frank scratched behind the dog's ears and was about to turn back toward home, when he heard the distinctive crack of a rifle shot, followed by the kind of silence that spoke volumes. He knew that silence. It was the sound of a miss, of expectations unfulfilled, of confidence slowly bleeding away. It was a sound he hadn't heard in decades, but it was burned into his memory like a scar that never quite healed. Back on the firing line, Rodriguez was beginning to consider options that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. Cancelling the training exercise, sending the Marines back to remedial marksmanship, calling in medical personnel to check for some kind of mass neurological event. None of these options were acceptable, but neither was the alternative of continuing to watch America's finest shooters embarrass themselves and their service. Colonel Harrison had climbed down from his observation tower and was walking slowly along the firing line, his experienced eyes taking in details that others might miss. The way the Marines held their rifles was correct. Their breathing techniques were textbook perfect. Their trigger control showed no obvious flaws, yet the results remained catastrophically consistent. He knelt beside Lance Corporal Thompson's shooting mat and examined the rifle with the kind of methodical attention that had served him well through 3 decades of service. The scope was properly mounted, the barrel showed no signs of damage, the action cycled smoothly. Every mechanical aspect of the weapon system was functioning exactly as it should. The colonel stood and walked to the spotting scope positioned behind the firing line, adjusting the focus until the distant target filled his field of view. 800 yards. In perfect conditions, with match-grade ammunition and properly trained Marines, it should have been child's play. The kind of shot that separated the professional from the amateur, but well within the capabilities of men who had earned their place at this school. He swept the scope across the impact area, noting the tight grouping of misses in the dirt, short and right of the target. The consistency was almost beautiful in its precision. If the Marines had been aiming at a point 20 feet short and 3 feet right of the target, they would have been performing magnificently, but they weren't. They were aiming exactly where they were supposed to aim, using techniques that had been proven effective through generations of combat, and somehow missing by the same margin every single time. The colonel had served in 3 different conflicts, had trained snipers who went on to make impossible shots in impossible conditions, had seen equipment failures and human failures, and every conceivable combination of things that could go wrong in the precise art of long-range shooting. But he'd never seen anything like this. At the fence line, Frank Castellano was having a conversation with a young Marine private who'd been assigned to perimeter security. The kid couldn't have been more than 20, with the kind of earnest face that reminded Frank of his own youth, back when the world seemed simpler and the enemies wore uniforms that made them easy to identify. "Sir, this is a restricted area," the private said, though his tone was polite rather than confrontational. Frank had the kind of presence that commanded respect, even in civilian clothes and walking a dog. "I know, son," Frank replied, his voice carrying the gravelly texture of age and cigarettes long since abandoned. "Just watching the show. Haven't seen Marines shoot in quite some time." The private glanced back toward the firing line, where the sound of another miss echoed across the range. "Well, sir, to be honest, they're not shooting all that great today." Frank nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the distant figures. "No," he said quietly. "I don't imagine they are." There was something in his tone that made the private look at him more carefully. The old man wasn't just a curious civilian who had wandered too close to a military exercise. There was a familiarity in the way he watched the Marines, a recognition that came from experience rather than simple interest. "Were you in the service, sir?" the private asked. Frank was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands absently stroking Gunner's head. "A long time ago," he finally said. "Different war, different world." Another shot cracked across the range, followed by the now familiar silence of failure. Frank's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for just a moment, the years seemed to fall away from his face. The private saw something flicker in the old man's eyes, a sharpness that suggested depths of experience that civilian life hadn't quite managed to bury. "They're missing," Frank said, though it wasn't really a question. "Yes, sir." "All morning. The instructors are pretty worked up about it." Frank nodded again, his gaze never leaving the firing line. In his mind, he was somewhere else entirely. A place where missing wasn't just embarrassing, it was fatal. Where the margin between success and catastrophic failure was measured in inches rather than feet, and where the lessons you learned came at a price that stayed with you forever. He was remembering a ridge in Korea, a bitter cold morning when nothing worked the way it was supposed to work, and the discovery that sometimes the most important lessons couldn't be found in any manual. The memory hit Frank with the force of a physical blow, so vivid he could almost feel the bite of the Korean wind against his face. He was 19 years old again, lying in a frozen foxhole on Hill 284, watching Chinese forces mass in the valley below through the scope of an M1C Garand. The date was November 15th, 1952, and everything the Marine Corps had taught him about shooting was proving spectacularly wrong. Just like these Marines, he had been missing everything. The private was still talking. Something about ammunition shortages and equipment checks. But Frank's mind was 50 years in the past. He remembered the crushing weight of failure, the way his hands had shaken not from cold, but from the dawning realization that when it mattered most, when lives hung in the balance, his carefully honed skills had simply vanished. His spotter, a kid named Murphy from Boston, had been getting increasingly agitated with each miss. "What the hell, Castellano? You could hit a dime at this range, back at Quantico. These slopes are sitting ducks and you're throwing rounds into the dirt like a boot at his first range day." Frank had checked and rechecked his rifle. The scope was properly zeroed. His form was perfect. His breathing was controlled. But shot after shot sailed harmlessly into the frozen ground, while Chinese soldiers moved with impunity through what should have been a killing field. It wasn't until Gunnery Sergeant Morrison crawled up to their position that everything changed. Morrison was old school, a relic from World War II who had fought at Guadalcanal and Peleliu. He had the kind of weathered face that spoke of too many battles and too many friends lost, and eyes that seemed to see things others missed. "Son," Morrison had whispered, settling in beside Frank's position. "You're shooting like you're back on the range at Pendleton. This ain't California. Different air, different rules." Frank had started to protest, to explain that he knew about environmental factors, that he'd adjusted for wind and temperature and all the variables they drilled into him during training. But Morrison had held up a hand, silencing him with a look. "Listen to me, boy. What's the one thing they never teach you in sniper school?" Frank had shaken his head, confused and desperate for any answer that might make sense of the morning's failures. "They never teach you that sometimes the air itself is lying to you." Back at the fence line, Frank blinked, returning to the present. The private was looking at him with concern, probably wondering if the old man was having some kind of episode. But Frank was perfectly clear now, more clear than he'd been in years. He understood what was happening to those Marines, understood it with the kind of certainty that came from having lived through the same nightmare. "Son," Frank said, his voice taking on a different quality, "I need to speak with whoever's running that range. The private shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, I can't just let civilians onto the range. There are protocols, security procedures." Frank turned to look at him directly, and the young Marine found himself staring into eyes that held depths of experience he couldn't begin to fathom. There was something there, a quiet authority that made his protestations die in his throat. "What's your name, Marine?" "Private Williams, sir." "Williams, those men down there are in trouble. Real trouble. And if someone doesn't help them figure out what's wrong, they're going to carry this failure with them for the rest of their careers. Some of them might never recover from it." Frank's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute conviction. "I've been where they are. I know what they're going through, and I know how to fix it." Private Williams looked back at the firing line, where another shot had just missed its mark. The frustration was visible even from this distance, the way the Marines clustered together in the universal posture of men trying to solve an unsolvable problem. "Sir, I'd have to call my sergeant, and he'd have to call the range officer. And they'd probably want to see some kind of ID, maybe run a background check." "How long would that take?" Williams did some quick mental math. "Couple hours, maybe more." Frank nodded toward the range. "In a couple hours, those Marines are going to be so rattled they might never trust their skills again. Some things can't wait for paperwork, son." The private was caught between regulations and instinct, between the rigid procedures that governed military life and the growing sense that this old man represented something important. He'd heard the stories, the whispered legends about veterans who carried knowledge that couldn't be found in any manual, hard-earned wisdom that came only from experience in places where theory met brutal reality. Down on the firing line, Rodriguez had called another ceasefire. The Marines were sitting up now, their rifles resting across their knees, their faces masks of confusion and growing despair. This was supposed to be the culmination of months of training, the final test that would certify them as Marine Corps scout snipers. Instead, it was turning into the kind of humiliation that could end careers. Colonel Harrison had rejoined Rodriguez behind the firing line, both men staring at the distant targets with the kind of intensity usually reserved for enemy positions. They'd run through every possible explanation, checked every variable, considered every factor that might account for the consistent pattern of misses. "Sir," Rodriguez said quietly, "I've never seen anything like this. It's like they've all suddenly forgotten how to shoot." The colonel nodded grimly. He'd been thinking the same thing, though he was reluctant to voice it. These weren't ordinary Marines. They were hand-selected marksmen who had already proven themselves in combat. The idea that they would all simultaneously lose their ability to hit a target was more than improbable. It was impossible. Yet the evidence was right there in the dirt berm. A tight grouping of misses that spoke to consistent error rather than random failure. Frank's weathered hands steadied on the fence as he watched the final transformation unfold below. The Marines who had spent the morning in crushing defeat were now putting round after round center mass, their confidence restored, their skills sharper than ever. The secret hadn't been in their equipment or their training. It had been in understanding that sometimes the simplest solutions hide behind the most complex problems. As Gunner tugged at his leash, eager to continue their walk, Frank smiled quietly. Some lessons could only be learned from those who had paid the price to understand them. The old ways, the forgotten wisdom, still had their place in a world that thought it had all the answers.